stop relying on fossil fuels and switch to cleaner, renewable energy sources. My opponent's secondary claims were switching to renewable energy resources will improve our economy, it will reduce pollution and global warming, and it will help the rest of the world. So in response to his first claim, he stated switching to renewable energy sources will improve our economy in the future. He states most of the technology needed to shift the world from fossil fuels to clean already exists, so there will be no money wasted for researching it. My opponent is making statements that are not supported by evidence. He fails to recognize the cost of the transition using renewable resources. According to GRIST, which is a nonprofit magazine that publishes news about the environment, claims that renewable standards would raise the cost of electricity, which its supporters seem reluctant to admit. If renewables really were cheaper, even with federal subsidies, it wouldn't take regulation to get utilities to use them. Within his first claim, my opponent also states that switching to renewable resources will open new factory jobs and provide more work for technicians. But he fails to explain specifically how it would work. According to GRIST, it would not provide jobs in the U.S., but more outside, thus cheaper labor. It does not guarantee a healthy domestic industry. My opponent's secondary claim was renewable energy sources will reduce pollution and global warming. My opponent is providing surface-level evidence. For example, he states renewable energy is clean energy, unlike fossil fuel, and he also states that 65% of global warming is estimated to come from energy generation and use. We know this already, but how does this reduce pollution? His examples of evidence are too generic, too broad, and the audience does not know how this will reduce pollution in our country, therefore making his second claim ineffective. In response to his third claim, he said, switching to renewable energy sources will help the rest of the world. My opponent states the U.S. has great influence on other countries, therefore it can influence third world countries. While this may be true, he contradicts himself, saying he needs to switch to improve our economy, and also adding that third world countries will be influenced by the U.S. However, third world countries rely on fossil fuels to keep their economies afloat. A study done by the National Academy of Science concludes that developing countries find themselves in an energy situation that is desperate and not growing any easier. In general, they have little or no flexibility in their choice of energy sources. They are dependent on fossil fuels, primarily oil, directly for their industrial growth. They may be influenced by the U.S., but taking action is a whole different story. So in conclusion, my opponent does not provide substantial evidence for his claims, does not consider counter-information for the job industry, nor considers the economic state of third world countries.
Well, I think your presentation has the advantage of being very direct in responding to the advocate's claims. It's pretty well organized. You've got evidence on each of the points, the first and the third points that you're responding to. The second point, you're kind of relying on a reasoning challenge to get through. On the first point, I think that the cost issue is pretty important, and you give an explanation about how it would increase the electricity cost. Making the transition to renewable resources, for instance, the idea that it's being oversimplified, I think that point needs to be developed. This is a good counterclaim on this issue, but as generic as the advocate's point was on this, yours is almost as generic, talking about what the costs are and how labor is going to get exported. You need to point out, for instance, that we've already got investments in fossil fuel production that would have to be timed out at some point, that investment in new infrastructure is particularly costly. If you had examples of companies that have failed without any support, or even companies that have failed with support, that would show that it is in fact problematic to be able to do those kinds of things. We got a whole bunch of wind farms out there, for instance, that are not producing any electricity because nobody can nobody could afford to keep doing them. They spent all their money to do it, and then they didn't have the ability to follow through on it. So you've got windmills turning around, but they're not really generating any electricity. I think those examples like that would be good to point out. On the second point, I think that you've got a good reasoning challenge here. But it's very generic. Like I said, the advocate, maybe they didn't have a lot of information, but you're not presenting a lot of information here either. There's not much demonstration that pollution is a widespread problem, and I think this would be a place where you could show that there are plenty of ways that pollution has been mitigated while using fossil fuels, that the general consequences are not as harsh as they were, that we've got new technologies that allow us to use fossil fuels in a safer way than we once used them when it comes to general air pollution. And then maybe some argument about global warming. You could either mitigate it, or you could argue that, for instance, the alternatives aren't going to be substantially advantageous, or maybe we've got other ways to mitigate it without necessarily changing from the fossil fuels that we're using. Like I said, it stays at a very generic level here. On the third point, you kind of argue that there's this sort of contradictory position that's being taken. Look, if there's an economic benefit to be had, and these third world countries are going to get, they don't have any choice. I like that part of the argument that says that they basically are limited. They might admire us for our ability to find green energy in our wheat fields by putting in windmills, or developing solar energy by building solar farms, that sort of thing to collect that. Does anybody know, is that what that thing is right outside of Prim? All right. They've got these 3 gigantic towers that they've built, and I was trying to figure. I drove by it the other day. You guys know Prim going to Las Vegas, state line? Is that a solar farm? And that's kind of what I was thinking. Holy criminy, it's a big project and it's going on and on and on. But if you got people who need electricity, waiting for the amount of money that it's going to take to build these solar farms, might be problematic. And I think that's the third world countries that you're talking about. So, they might admire us for our ability to do all that kind of stuff, but the truth of the matter is they got people to feed, they got to create jobs, they got to produce growth, and they got to do it now. And those things are complicated, costly, that sort of thing. Go back to your first point and reemphasize that cost is the key issue here. I do think that you have one general argument that you come back to on these points, and it's an argument that you want to keep emphasizing throughout this, and that is, if all of these things were in fact cost competitive, we'd be doing them. That there's an incentive to do that. If somebody's going to save money, if somebody's going to make money from doing that, people would be doing it. The reason that they aren't being done is because at the moment they aren't cost competitive, and that's the key issue you've got. All right.